Good morning. Thank you for joining us. We're here in the Flow Hive apiary, just here on my own today. The team's away, but if you want to put your questions in, I've dialed in Trace, who usually reads out the questions, and she's in my pocket here. Hello, Trace.
Hey, good morning.
If you can hear Trace, just let me know. Hopefully you can hear that okay. She'll be reading out any questions you put in the comments. The idea is you put your questions in, and we help answer them to help you get started in beekeeping. So don't be shy, put your questions in. Meanwhile, we might harvest a little bit of honey. I'll show you around what's going on in the apiary, and meanwhile, put your questions in. Okay, so this hive here, I just noticed that the numbers have dropped. Now that can happen for a few reasons. Perhaps your hive has swarmed, perhaps there's a problem in the brood box, perhaps they've changed their queen for another reason. But the camera work's not going to be quite as good today. We don't have the usual film crew behind the camera. So I'm hoping you can see that. We're just looking in the window of the Flow Hive, and you can see there's just not quite as many bees as normal. Now, if you see that, good idea to get in there and do a brood inspection. We won't be doing that today. That'll be hard work to do the camera and the brood inspection. If you want to see what that looks like, jump into last week's video, and we went right through pulling apart this hive right here and showing you how to do your brood inspections. So any questions, put them in the comments. I'll see if we can get some honey flowing here from this hive. If you have a look at this window, you'll notice that there's honey missing in some cells, and that's when they're a little bit hungry. So we won't harvest a whole lot today. We'll just harvest one frame, leave the rest for the bees, and hopefully the flowers will start flowering again soon. It ebbs and flows in our area, so sometimes you get situations where there's not many flowers flowering, and other times you get a whole lot flowering, and it'll do that all year round. Spring is the most reliable time. We're looking in the window here at the bees. As you can see, there is bees there, but there's not like the usual amount of bees you see when you look in the window. You can see some nice capping, so we will go ahead and harvest this frame, and hopefully there will be some nice honey coming out that we can share around. It's a good time of year to be sharing honey around to loved ones, and it's just a beautiful thing. So is there any questions coming in, Trace?
Yes, Cedar, and it's all looking good from my end here, so that's great. Look, there's a question, it's coming from Jules, and the question is, why is it so hard to start? Now, Jules, you might need to, I'm not sure whether you're talking about starting the beekeeping or starting the video, so maybe Jules just put a few more little bits of info on that one. But then Rodney's asking, how do these hives hold up in the wintertime?
Okay, so that's a common question, and beekeepers keep bees in wooden hives just like this all around the world, in cold climates, in hot climates, and so on. So they hold up well in cold climates. There's different schools of thought around insulating and not insulating and so on. In Europe, they will often be keeping bees with screened bottom boards, totally open all through the winter, and even when there's snow and so on. So these are Apis mellifera, the European honeybee. They are very good at surviving and keeping themselves warm. They use honey to actually keep themselves warm. They disconnect their wing muscles, they vibrate, and as long as they've got enough honey stores, they can survive quite cold conditions. So the answer is yes, the Flow Hive works in cold climates. So I'm just turning that key there now a couple of times, and you should start to see honey flowing right out of the hive. If you're in a cold climate, chime in on the thread. Let us know where you are and how your bees are going. We're wintertime in the Northern Hemisphere, and just let us know how your flow hives are doing. So look at that beautiful, beautiful honey just coming right out of the hive there. It's a wonderful thing. Any questions? Put them in the comments. We'll get to answering those.
Great, Cedar. Just on that wintering that you were just talking about, Jules has come back now. I'm just wondering, how much do you need to leave in the hive for winter?
Great question. So that really varies depending on where you are in the world. So here we don't need to leave any because we get good flowers in the winter. But in places where you've got a lot of a long cold winter, snow, etc., then you might need to leave a whole box of honey. In extreme cases, 2 boxes of honey. And that knowledge will be best found from your local beekeepers. So ask around. It's a great thing of sharing knowledge and learning from your locals, how they do it, how they get their bees to survive over the winter. And ask more than one beekeeper, because ask 2 beekeepers, you'll always get 3 answers. Okay.
Great, Cedar. And this is, this is great. We've got Kathleen, who's just tuned in from Western Washington. Of course, they're expecting a white Christmas, the complete opposite to us, and just saying their bees seem to have plenty of stores for winter, which is a great way to be heading into the winter season.
Excellent. That's great. Thanks for chiming in. This is really interesting. You can see here darkness in the comb and light above, and that's just simply because the honey's drained out from this section, drained out from beneath their feet, and it's still draining down the comb at this level here. So it's gradually disappearing out of the frame and into my jar here. It's a beautiful thing to watch through the side windows. Okay. You can see that.
Fantastic. Cedar, this was a question that came in yesterday from customer support. Actually, a woman who was harvesting her bees, she'd been told by a beekeeper that it wasn't fully capped off; it was only 60%, and that it was all right to harvest the honey from her flow frames. What are your thoughts on that?
So it is conventionally. Conventional beekeepers in a commercial scale will typically take the honey if it's 70% capped. Now, one of the reasons why they do that is they're blending all the honey together. So if they've got another frame that is capped, if you like, that thickens up the honey that might be a bit runny in that other frame. So yes, you can take it, but if it is a bit liquid, once it's cooled down on the shelf, then just keep it in the fridge or consume it before any fermentation occurs. Generally, I would wait a little bit more than 70%, simply because we tend to keep the honey separate. So this honey separate from the next frame, because you can, and you can enjoy those flavors. So it's one of the joys. One thing you could do, if you did notice you harvested honey that was a little bit too liquid, and just shake it around a bit once it's cooled down, see if it feels like honey, or you can get a thing called a refractometer to test it. Now, if you find that it's a little bit liquid, then you could mix it with some other honey you've already harvested, just like the commercial operations do. Or, as said, you could just keep it in the fridge to prolong it, or consume it, or make some honey mead. So not the end of the world. It happens occasionally, but generally we can tell when it's nice and capped, like we were looking through this side window. You can see the capping on this frame, even though I couldn't see it at the end. So that's why I chose to harvest that one. If I had harvested some of these middle frames, it would have been a bit of a wild card, because I can see the pattern decreasing, them eating away cells. I know that they're probably eating away some of the cells just above the brood nest in the center. So that's why I'm choosing an edge one. After a while, you'll learn what this means as it changes, and get a really good idea of what that means inside the hive, and you'll be able to harvest it when the honey's nice and ready. Okay.
Great, and on that same question, Cedar, Lindsay's asking, do you normally check the flow frames? You talked about it, you can see the outside ones, but do you check the middle ones before they're fully capped, before you harvest?
Look, I don't tend to. The whole idea with this invention is you can look into the hive, see when it's ready, and take the honey away in a very gentle way. So here I can look into the hive, and because I guess experienced at this, I can get a really good idea of what's going on in terms of, is there a flow on? Are they likely to have eaten a bunch of the honey out of some of the cells? And you do that by looking at this end frame periodically and checking for when they're actually uncapping and taking some of the honey away. And if that's the case, then it's likely that there's some honey missing in the middle. You might want to wait till it's in a filling pattern. Then you know they would have filled up that area they've eaten above the brood nest. That and the side windows gives you a really good idea of when it's time to harvest and when it's not. Okay, we're getting a bit of background noise there, Trace. Hello, Trace, come in. We might have lost Trace.
Yeah, sorry, Cedar, I think that was... Have you got me there, Cedar?
Yep, I've got you. Ask questions. Trace is in my pocket in a phone. She's reading out the questions. Just give us a thumbs up if you can indeed hear Trace when she reads the questions, okay?
Thanks, Cedar. Question regarding our hives. Do the bees drop their numbers to match conditions, or do they just naturally die off?
They're very clever. They will scale the egg laying to what's going on in the environment. And the reason why they need to do that is there's no point in laying a whole lot of eggs that's going to need potentially a frame of honey and a frame of pollen to raise into bees if there is no nectar around. That would likely be the demise of the hive. So what they do is they tend to throttle their egg laying to what's going on in terms of nectar and pollen stores coming in the door. And that way you'll naturally see the numbers drop off and pick up depending on what's going on in the surrounding environment. And of course, the health of your hive and the virility of your queen.
Cedar, John's asking, can you install a hive into your house or into a shop?
You certainly can. If you dial back a number of live streams, we were harvesting in a shop called Harvest Cafe here. And they have one of these in their deli. They have a flow hive that's been cut down and tiled out vertically to create a hive that's more of an observation hive. So you can do that, or you can keep it in its current form like this and create a big pipe for the bees to fly out of. Typical to use a big clear pipe, so you can watch the bees as they go about their business and all of the things they do. And there's a little bit to it. You can you sometimes find that the bees struggle a little bit more in an observation hive. It's a bit harder for them to get in and out. So from time to time, you might need to swap those bees to an outside hive and switch out for another colony that's healthy. The bigger you make their exit pipe, if you're doing that, the better. If it's nice and big, then the bees can probably fly out of the hive by going up the tube and out rather than having to walk all that way, which will slow them down a bit. Great questions.
Yeah, great. Douglas is tuning in from Florida in the United States, and he was told, a local beekeeper told him the other day that he went from one hive to 5 in his first year, each with a full honey super. Just wondering if that's the average, and what is the normal growth when you start with one hive?
Okay, so it really depends on you. If you're hot to trot and you want to be splitting hives as quick as you can even build up faster than that. So well done on building up to 5. That's amazing. But an extreme example is probably my sister, who she's living on my property at the moment, and she brought 2 hives there, and now she's got, I think, 40 hives, and we're 18 months later. So she's been splitting and building because that's what she wants to do. So beekeepers that are breeding and splitting, and then they usually start breeding queens and so on, can really build up their numbers of hives very quickly, provided the season is treating them kindly. But yes, on the other example, sometimes you can get a hive that doesn't tend to build up. I've got one outside my door at home like that. It just throttles itself nicely to the seasons. It's been about 4 years now, no swarming. It just keeps ticking away, making honey. And I have taken a split from it just as show and tell as spring management, but otherwise I've just left it the rest of the time in terms of management. So it largely depends on genetics, how quick they breed up. Some bees just jump out of their skin and really demand to have some more hives, getting some splits made and things like that. And other bees will just cruise along. So it's a good idea just to pay attention to your bees and really adjust accordingly. If they're really building up and spilling out the front, and it's likely they might swarm, perhaps at springtime, get in there, make your splits, and you can build up that way. Or if you don't want to make your splits, then you could just go through what's called spring management, where you make up frames that are fresh, or if you're using naturally drawn comb, you'll cut out some of the wax in here and free up some space in the brood nest, which will limit the bees from doing their natural division, which we call a swarm.
Fantastic. Cedar, this is a good question. Why do people cream honey? Is it just for the texture?
Okay, there's a few kinds of honey. So there's candied honey, which sometimes gets cold creamed, and that's where you actually purposefully get your honey to go candied, but you make it into a really nice fine candy. Colder climates, that becomes a typical way because it's hard to stop the honey candying anyway. It's a natural thing that happens. Temperature affects it, the types of sugar ratios in the honey as well. But if you want a specific nice fine candy that feels very smooth on your tongue, then usually people will seed that with another fine candy. And if you put 5 or 10% of a nice fine candy into your honey, as it candies, it will take on that same crystalline structure. So you'll get that nice fine candy. Otherwise, it's a wild card where you might get really coarse sugar crystals, which might not be as desirable as a texture. There's another one called whipped honey, where you might get that coarse candied honey on your shelf, stick it in a blender and whip it up, and that'll break all those sugar crystals into nice smooth ones. That can be fun. However, left on the shelf, it'll usually separate, so you'll need to keep that one in the fridge. There's all sorts of different ways to enjoy honey. My kids really love the candied honey, even really big chunky sugar crystals. They call it the crispy honey, and they'll prefer that over liquid honey like this.
And fantastic. I think growing up in New Zealand, we were big fans of the creamed honey. I remember it well.
Yes. So we got.
So you're just wondering, Jules is asking, and I know you get asked this question a lot, and you're in a nice, comfy position there. How did you come up with this great design of the Flow Hive?
So basically, I was keeping bees in the conventional manner and selling honey to the local shops, and I had 40 hives. I was working, and it was hot, sweaty, messy, hard work, as many of you would know, where you get out there and you take all of these boxes off, and you're in your bee suit, you've got your smoker, and you go through, you either take all the honey frames out and put them in tubs, trying to brush off all the bees as you go. Perhaps you're using a leaf blower to get the bees out of the boxes, or perhaps you're using clearer boards where you go in and a two-stage system and try and get the bees to move out of the boxes. Then you take those honey frames to a processing shed. In my case, it was the shed I was living in. And that's then begins the work of uncapping the frames with a hot knife and spinning those frames in a centrifuge, then filtering all the wax and bee bits out of the from the extractor into another vessel, and then finally jarring it up after that. And I thought, wow, I almost felt bad delivering the buckets of honey to the shops. It's like I put so much effort into that. How can I accept the amount of money for the bucket of honey? And I thought there must be a better way, a way where the bees can just go about their business like this. Bees on this side, I haven't even noticed that anything's really changed in the hive. They're still going about their business, yet we're tapping off honey at the back of the hive here into the jar with very little effort as we talk. So no, it did take a decade to actually prove it out because you have to get the tick off from the bees. It's one thing to design something that you think might work, but it's another for the bees to actually accept it and use it and for it to become a really useful function. And then there's a whole refinement after that. So my father and I spent a decade fine tuning and tweaking the invention before we finally put it on crowdfunding. And many of you know that story. So it was really just to solve a problem of how can we do this in a gentle, easy way.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, Cedar. And look, and just for beginner beekeepers, there's a couple of questions now, of course, coming in. Tips and tricks for getting started. And is there any particular hives that you would recommend for beginners?
Okay, my favourite thing to do, everything in life, is just to jump in and learn as you go. But other people like to take a much more measured approach. It doesn't matter which way you go. Some people like to go and do a bee course. Maybe it's an online course. We've got a great one at the beekeeper.org. Or you might like to go and do a hands-on bee course. Or you might just like to buy your equipment and learn as you go, find out what you need to do, get some help from local beekeepers and things like that. So it doesn't matter which way you go. The main thing is that you're learning and looking after your bees and having a good time. So there's a few ways to get started there. If you do really want to do an online course, we're getting amazing reviews for the one we put together at the beekeeper.org, which has lots of experts from around the world chiming in and teaching beekeeping, including my father and myself. And it's good because it's got people in cold climates, in snow, in all the different parts of the world. So it's a great learning, and also scientists tuning in with a really deep scientific knowledge of bees as well. So that's a good one to do. But there's also other courses out there as well. So and plenty of books depending on which way you like to learn. But it's nice, I think, to start off with a small colony and nurture it. So you get a split from another beekeeper, or buy what's called a nucleus, or start with a package and transfer them into your Flow Hive and just enjoy the process of really watching them build up and fill out all their frames with wax and the queen laying and so on. It's a beautiful world to witness, and you really do get people saying, why didn't I do this 20 years earlier? So I hope you enjoy it too.
Thanks, Ada. Look, and you were talking about mead before, and a few people are coming in saying they've got so much honey. And any tips or about making mead, or where you find all that information from?
Okay. I have to say, the mead I've made so far hasn't been that good. It's it is a bit of a job to make really nice mead, and I think one of the secrets is actually a one of my brother-in-laws makes some really nice mead, and he tends to like to use wine yeast to kick it off, whereas I just went for natural, which means it's a bit of a wild card what yeasts you get and so on. And if you want more certain results, then I think use that wine yeast. There was a wasp that just landed. Now wasps don't bother us here in Australia. Other countries have the wasps that really hassle the hives and eat bees and stuff, but we don't have that problem, thankfully.
So Janet's asking, how long should they wait for a queenless hive to raise a new queen once they've introduced a frame of brood eggs and honey?
Okay, that's a good question. So it's going to be a bit of a trick. Often you're waiting at least a couple of weeks, because what's got to happen is if you're putting in eggs, then there's a 16-day gestation period for a queen, and then she has to mate after that. So it's going to be closer to a month by the time she's laying, because depending on the weather, it could be a couple of weeks before she's in full flight laying. But yes, I guess the earliest would be something like 20 days before she's laying, from egg to queen. So get in there and check. Sometimes you can get into a situation where you've added brood with eggs in it to your queenless hive, and they don't raise a queen. Other times they will actually not accept a new queen, even if you put a new queen in or a queen cell. So you're going to have to do some inspections, just make sure they're on the right track. A couple of little bees, it is a hungry time. You noticed I pulled one out of the honey earlier. Now, if that happens, you can put a bit of kitchen wrap over the top, because we don't want you to get in the honey there. Come on, out you go. Sorry, I'm not doing very good camera work here. I'm flying solo today. Don't have the usual finesse.
You're doing well, Cedar.
Okay, now I do have I did come prepared with one of these wax wraps in my pocket, in case you do get bees coming for the honey. Good idea to have something to cover it up. So I'm going to do that now, and I might just put the camera down because I can't shoo that bee away. Put the wrap on and hold the camera. Okay, so all I'm going to do is cover that up. It's a nice malleable material, and that will just limit that access. Squeeze it right around the back of the tube there, and there we go. Covered it up. There was quite a big hoo-ha in the beginning, with people really worried about the way we were harvesting honey out of the hive, but of course you can just cover it up if that's an issue. A lot of people don't believe that bees won't go for it, and the truth is they do sometimes, and you should cover it up, but mostly they don't. They're too busy foraging and doing their work, and it takes some time for one bee to find it and go back and do the dance and tell the rest and so on. They only really come in droves while you're harvesting if they're already in a robbing mood. Perhaps you've left some honey out and the bees have got a taste for it, and they're robbing weak hives out and things like that, which isn't good. And in that case, they'll come very quickly to your jar of exposed honey. So be prepared with a little something to cover it up.
Great. Cedar, Tizza, who tunes in every week, just wondering about the hive. Should they paint it first or assemble it first?
Okay, that's a good question. Now, I go for assemble first. I find that easier. If you are going for paint, like you can see in this hive up here, you can see this is a beautiful paint job. You can have a lot of fun painting hives. There's some great artwork here by Sarah. And one of the things when you're painting is to not get too much paint on the closures. So if you painted the whole hive in separate parts and then tried to put it together, you might struggle because the paint blobs will jam up the finger joints. So I tend to put it together and paint afterwards, and just leave the inside natural for the bees, but do paint the insides of the opening surfaces, because they're not in contact with the bees, and they're also subject to more moisture as the rain comes in these areas. You can also paint the inside if you want to. That's very common in beekeeping too. Okay, I've got a nice big jar of honey there, which is great. Some good questions coming in today. Don't be shy. If you also know the answers to questions, then chime in on the thread. That's what it's all about, is just helping each other learn about bees. You can see the comb there is nice and white now because the honey's drained out from beneath their feet. There wasn't a whole lot of bees in this hive to start with. We do need to check in on this hive. So we've got a similar amount to when we started. Sometimes bees will clear out if they need to ventilate more, but because there's already plenty of ventilation here, they haven't bothered to do that while we're harvesting. And you can see the bees just already starting to chew away at different parts and they'll start the process of fixing up the cells, and the whole process starts again. So all of that wax capping that they've made, they'll tear off, and they'll use that to repair the cells, and away they go again.
So, any tips on best treatment for bee stings? Someone's tuned in and suggested maybe honey.
Okay, I have heard that. I haven't really tested and measured that much myself, but let us know how you go. One thing that's common is adding a bit of smoke if you're doing your inspections and you haven't been wearing gloves and you don't mind a sting or two. Then it's typical to get a sting or two on your hands, and beekeepers will often blow a bit of smoke onto it, but that's more to get rid of the pheromone. Oh, look at this beautiful bee on this flower here. Get rid of that pheromone. That's a very young bee. You notice it's fluffy and it's just come out of the hive and travelled a short distance. But yes, the pheromone of the sting can often encourage other bees to get into the mood of protecting their hive as well. So nice idea to add a little bit of a smoke to those hands to mask the pheromones. But yeah, if you've had success with honey on bee stings, let us know.
Cedar, obviously it's getting pretty hot here, especially in the northern parts here of Australia. People sort of commenting on the bees bearding outside their boxes. And actually, I noticed in my own garden the same things happened. Is that just due to the heat and someone's wanting to spray them with a little bit of water to cool them down?
Bees are very clever at cooling themselves. You could take the tray out the bottom altogether and plenty of ventilation. This hive's not bearding. I was trying to show you an example, but yeah, it's very hot. Hives with healthy numbers, as the day goes on, this hive probably will beard. I noticed earlier when I was having a look around, there's healthy numbers in this hive, but they're not hard packed yet. So a hive that you couldn't see the comb on a hot day, half the bees will have to get out just to get enough ventilating airflow through the hive in order to cool it. They'll go and collect water and use evaporative cooling techniques as they fan to do their air conditioning, which is pretty ingenious, really. But yes, don't be concerned if it's hot and you get a bee beard out the front. Sign of a very healthy hive. If it is springtime, then it could be a sign you need to do your splits if there's that many bees. But later on in the season, they're probably unlikely to swarm, or there's some genetics will still swarm for late swarms. But generally, they're bearding because they're hot later on in the season. Just have a little look.
Charles is coming in from Texas. Charles from Texas. He's going to move 2 hives about 350 metres. Just wondering what time of the day and what season would be best. They're having very mild winters.
Okay, very mild winters. I'm still looking for bearding bees. There's none on this one, but if I go down a little bit further, the next one's just starting to beard as it is a very, very hot day here. And go all the way up the hive to the roof sometimes if you've got a lot of bees, and they probably need some more room if they're that big. But it also could be just that it's super hot. So moving hives, there's a few tricks to moving hives. Let us know how far you need to move them. I'll explain a couple of techniques. If you need to move a hive a short distance, then what I tend to do is, if it's very short, I'll just move it a couple of meters a day. And what that'll do is just allow the bees to follow to their own location. The bees will follow along. Now, if you need to move a hive, let's say across to the other side of your yard, then or anything up to about say anything less than about 4 miles, 6 kilometers, then you can use an orientation technique, bearing in mind that the bees are locking onto their location by taking landmarks around, and they can fly. Usually they're foraging in that radius. So if you just pick up your hive and move it, they will actually a lot of the bees will go home to the original location. So one of the ways around that, well, there's two ways around that. One is you move them more than about 4 miles, 6 kilometres, leave them there for a month till there's a whole lot of new forager bees, and then take them back, and then they won't remember that you've shifted them to another location. So that's a typical way to do it. But if you don't want to do that double move, there's another technique to disorientate them, where you just move them a short distance, say close them up early in the morning, make sure they've got plenty of ventilation, take the screen out, you're strapping them down, you're loading them onto a pickup truck or a trailer or something like that, and making sure that's well tied down. You go and drop it off at the new location, try and drive in the cooler parts of the day, the morning or the evening. And the idea is you then open the entrance, but before you open the entrance, break off a bunch of very foliage-laden branches and put them in front of the hive, or get an old t-shirt and tape it on the front of the hive, so that when those bees race out of their hive, they'll crash into those obstacles. And that means most of them will go, hey, something's changed, and they'll go on another orientation flight to reorientate to that new location. And instead of getting half the hive returning to the old spot, you'll get about 5% of the bees returning to the old location. Now, if there's other hives at the old location, you can just let them find their way into other hives. If there's no other hives, then you might like to put a box there of any description where the hive was. You can collect those bees every 3 days or so and ferry them back to your new hive location. So there's pros and cons to all of these methods, but the options there, we've got more detailed and live examples in the beekeeper.org if you want to see really how to move your hive, close it, strap them down. Some great little tips like using a bit of smoke on the outside of the hive. Sometimes you're moving them in the time when there's a lot of bearding going on, and you might need to add a bit of smoke and wait a few minutes, add a bit more smoke, and that will just encourage those bees that are bearding on the outside to go into the hive, so you can seize the moment to close it. Now, if you're in a cold climate like you are, perhaps your bees aren't flying much, and you might need some local knowledge for this. But if your bees aren't foraging, then there may be an opportune moment to move your hive without the issue of a whole lot of foragers returning to the old spot. But I haven't kept bees in those cold climate areas. So chime in if you have about moving hives in winter.
Great. Cedar, is it normal for the bees to eat a little bit of the wood around the flow hive entrance?
Yeah, it's semi-normal. It's most of the hives don't, but some do, and it's a pretty normal activity for bees is to make their home and shape it how they want. But there must be a genetic trait, because every now and then you get a hive that you can even hear the noise of the hive chewing away at the wood, whether it be up here, in there, or over at the entrance. And it can be actually quite loud, this chewing sound of the bees as they use their pincers to break off little tiny bits of wood. And over time, they'll open up the entrance or whatever they're trying to do, or make another entrance up here by chewing away at the wood. So yes, that's relatively normal. Excuse the delay. There's a little bit of a delay happening between when Trace gets the stream and when she's able to.
Cedar, can you use the ant protectors from the Flow Hive 2 Plus? Oh, sorry about that, Seeds. Can you use the ant guards from the Flow Hive 2 Plus to the Flow Hive 2?
You can't swap them between, but what we did is we made a variant. So there's ones with number 12 on them, and there's ones with number 14 on them. The Flow Hive 2 Plus, we made these sturdier legs. You can see down here. I'll just show you on the camera. We moved the bolt out to the edge and also increased the size just to really make it even more solid. And this is cast aluminium. So what that meant is there's two different sizes. So just get in touch with Trace if you phone up, or use your or contact him however way you like, and you can make sure you're ordering the right one for you. It's basically just those 12 and 14. The 14 is the largest size, which is the Flow Hive 2 Plus. Obviously, we don't have these activated at the moment. The ants aren't too bad. If the ants get bad, then we'll cut away this foliage, make sure the ant traps have some oil or grease in them, and we'll do that for a little while till the ant problem goes away.
Cedar, do you ever use a double brood box, and is it recommended or not recommended for the Flow Hive?
So double brood box. The brood box, for those that don't know, is the box where the queen is laying her babies. So for us, it's this bottom box here, and then there's an excluder, this black line, in between the two boxes, which limits the queen coming up and laying in your flow frames. So I'd like to keep it in this configuration just for simplicity, where there's only one box to look through if you do need to find the queen for any reason. And in this configuration, they are more likely to swarm with a single brood box and a single top box. But my preferred method is just simply to take splits in the springtime to limit swarming activity and create more colonies rather than larger, fewer colonies. But it depends. Other people like to go for multiple brood boxes and multiple supers, really stack their hives up tall. So it depends on your strategy there. And also in colder climates, sometimes you are stacking more boxes for more storage for the winter time. So if you do have a second brood box, the bees will be storing a lot of honey on the edges of those two brood boxes, which might help your bees through a long, cold winter.
Cedar, will the new bases fit on the classic hive? So the bases for the Flow Hive 2 and the 2 Plus, could you purchase one of those and use it on your classic or your hybrid hive?
You can. So Tracy's probably best to answer those questions. She deals a lot with the helping all of our customers. You might recognise her voice if you've ever called the office. So yes, you can. The only caveat on that is the size discrepancy between the Classic and the Flow Hive 2 and 2 Plus is there's a couple of millimeters difference. So you'll notice that the base will sit just inside a few millimeters shy of the dimensions of the Classic, which doesn't really matter, but just something you should know. Here's the honey frame we've harvested. The bees are going about their work. You can see the cappings all light as the honey's drained out from beneath their feet. The bees have cottoned on and they're chewing away at the wax, and they're going to go about their process of fixing up those cells we've harvested honey from, and the whole process will start again. You can also see here the honey's drained out of that frame, and we've got a beautiful jar of honey here that I've covered up because we had a couple of bees coming for the honey. Look at that. It's a beautiful honey to share around. Great thing to do this time of year. Of course, if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, you're probably not harvesting now because you might be knee-deep in snow. It's amazing. If you are in a snowy place with your hives right now, I'd love to see it. It's just such a contrast. We're here, I'm sweating, standing here. The honey's coming out really fast because it's a hot day, and I'd love to see your hives if they're out there in the cold, in the snow. Okay, got time for a couple more questions.
Christopher's saying, Cedar, yep, Christopher's saying, have you ever thought about making a little molded sort of tubing kind of collecting honey thing to save from using the wraps, so when you're harvesting to keep the bees out?
We have. We've come up with multiple different ones, manifolds, elbow tubes, and all of that. And we haven't made that available yet, but at some stage we hope to. But it's quite simple. If you don't have anything to cover your jar, you can just use a wrap. But some people do find some plumbing bits and elbows and piping to buckets and so on. But what I find is it's really nice just to harvest single frames to single jars, or to maybe a single frame to multiple jars, but you're isolating the flavors from one frame to the next and really enjoying those flavors as they come in. It becomes a talking point when people come to visit, and it's one of the joys of beekeeping is the many different flavors of honey as the seasons change. Um, but yes, if you want to, you can find an elbow piece and go through a hole in the lid of your jar. And some people do that. I like to just keep it simple myself because this works well and the bees really come for the honey. But if you are going to go off to the shops for a few hours, then do make sure you cover it up. You don't want to get into a situation where you return and the bees are getting into a robbing frenzy. Okay, one more question.
Nice. So, is it okay? Just had a question come in. Did a harvest on the weekend and got a little bit of bleaking honey. Is it all right to have a bit of bleaking honey? And if it goes through to the brood box, will the bees just kind of clean it up themselves?
Yes, a little bit's fine. The bees are used to cleaning up honey spills in the conventional way. I'd be spilling a lot of honey as I cracked off the conventional lids and broke all the comb. And you often see honey even draining out the front of the hive in an extreme case. I guess in nature too, as things shift and change in their tree hollows and so on, they might be used to cleaning up broken bits of comb. So they're quite good at it. If it's getting extreme where you're getting liters like this amount of honey spilling through your hive and collecting in the tray at the bottom, then there could be an issue with your setup. Do get in contact. There could be an issue with your frames. Perhaps they're not aligning properly anymore, and you need to go through a process of realigning them. But it is common for frames to spill a bit of honey, and for the bees to simply clean that up. If you've got our Flow Hive too, then it will end up in a tray at the bottom here. Okay, thank you very much for tuning in, and I wish the best of season's greetings to you, and I hope has been a pretty wonky few years, and I do hope you get some time to spend with your loved ones, and that your bees, if you're in the northern hemisphere, are doing well through the cold time, and for those here in Australia and in the southern hemisphere, that you're able to harvest a bit of honey to share around. That's the frame we've harvested. We've got a nice big jar of honey, which is a beautiful thing. I'm just going to harvest one today because the bees are a bit hungry at the moment. It ebbs and flows in our area, and we want to leave the rest for the bees. Thank you very much for tuning in. Thanks for all your great questions. And if you've got answers to other people's questions, help them by tuning in on the thread